I married Adelaide Voss on a Tuesday in March, in front of a circuit judge who'd ridden 2 days out of his way and clearly wanted to be somewhere warmer. I did not know her favorite color. I did not know if she took her coffee black. I knew she could read and write a fair hand, that she'd been raised proper in Ohio, and that she'd answered my letter, the one my sister had half-shamed me into writing, with 3 pages instead of 1. That should have told me something. I was too tired to notice. I'd buried my first wife, Ruth, 2 winters back. Fever took her in 4 days flat, and it took something out of me I never did find again. I don't talk much about those 4 days. I'll say this much. A house goes quiet in a particular way after a death in it, a quiet that isn't peace, and I lived in that quiet for 2 years before my sister, me, rode out from her place near Bozeman and sat across my own table like a woman come to collect a debt. Caleb, she had Pa's way of saying my name when she meant business. You need a wife, not a memorial. I've got a ranch to run, me. You've got a ranch running you into the ground. Ezra says you haven't smiled since the 4th of July, and that was a fist fight. I didn't smile then either, but she wasn't wrong about the ranch. Cedar Draw was 1,100 head that spring, 2 hired hands who weren't much for cooking, and a house built for a family that had shrunk down to 1 grieving man who ate standing at the stove more nights than not. I wrote the letter mostly to quiet her. I did not expect much to come of it. Men out here write those letters all the time and half get no answer at all, and I told myself I wouldn't mind either way. Her letter back was 3 pages in a small, careful hand, and it told me plainer than any conversation would have that Adelaide Voss thought before she wrote a word. She asked about the ranch, the weather, whether I kept a garden. She asked, near the end, if I intended a real marriage or an arrangement of convenience, and said she'd be honest with me either way, but needed to know which she was agreeing to. I wrote back, an arrangement, ma'am, honestly stated. I've buried a wife and don't know that I've got more than that left in me, but I'd treat you fair, and the house needs someone in it who isn't me. She wrote back 1 line, fair is enough to start on, I'll come in March. I read that line a dozen times before I understood why it stayed with me. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't hope, exactly. It was a woman taking stock of what was on offer and deciding it would do. I recognized that kind of arithmetic. I'd been doing it myself since Ruth died, counting up what a day required and doing only that, nothing more, nothing that might cost something extra. Adelaide stepped off the stage in a gray traveling dress with a trunk that weighed more than she did, and she looked at Cedar Draw, the whole sprawling, wind-scraped spread of it, like a woman doing arithmetic. Weighing it. Not with fear, with calculation. I'd learn later that was just how she looked at everything, houses and horses and men included, like she was deciding what it would cost her to stay. Mr. Odell, she said, and put her hand out like we were closing a cattle deal, not a marriage. Ma'am, I shook it. Her grip was steadier than mine. She was smaller than I'd pictured from the letters, dark-haired, plain-dressed, with a way of holding her chin that told you she'd learned somewhere not to duck her head for anybody. 26, she'd written. Old enough that her father's dry goods store in Millbrook, Ohio, had stopped fielding suitors and started, in her words, fielding apologies on my behalf. She hadn't elaborated. I hadn't asked. We rode to the house in near silence. I pointed out the barn, the bunkhouse, the creek that ran low this time of year, the line of cottonwoods that marked the eastern boundary. She nodded at each the way you'd nod at a shopkeeper's inventory, noted, filed, no comment offered. I didn't know then that silence for her wasn't emptiness. It was armor. I'd find that out slow, the way you find out most things worth knowing. The house itself I'd built with my own hands 8 years back, before Ruth, added onto twice since. 4 rooms downstairs, 3 up, a porch that faced west so you could watch the weather come at you across the flats before it arrived. I'd swept it that morning, which was the extent of my preparation, and I saw her eyes move over the bare walls, the absence of anything you'd call decoration, the particular starkness of a house kept by a man who'd stopped noticing what a house could be. "It'll do," she said, which I took correctly as the whole of her opinion on the matter. The house ran fine after that. That was the trouble, if I'm honest, it ran too fine. Adelaide had the place clean within a week, meals on time, my shirts mended before I noticed they were torn. My two hands, Tobias Ray's and old Pete Hargrove, started eating better than they had in a year, and said so, more than once, with the particular gratitude of men who'd been surviving on my own cooking. She did all of it without complaint and without much talk either. At supper she'd ask about the herd, I'd answer in as few words as I could manage, and that was the whole conversation some nights. I'd clear my plate and go sit on the porch with my pipe, and she'd clear the table and go, I didn't know where those first weeks. To bed, I assumed. I didn't ask. I told myself that was enough. A house running smooth. A woman who didn't fuss, no scenes, no demands beyond what was reasonable. I'd had my fill of feeling things too hard back when Ruth died, and a marriage that asked nothing of me but bread on the table seemed, God help me, like a mercy. It took me longer than it should have to notice I'd married a woman, and was treating her like a hired hand who happened to sleep down the hall. Pete noticed before I did. Pete Hargrove was 60 if he was a day, had worked this land before I bought it, and had a way of saying things sideways that took me a week sometimes to hear properly. "Your wife eats supper alone most nights," he said to me one evening, out at the corral, not looking at me, just working a knot out of a lead rope. "She eats with me. She sits at the table with you. Ain't the same thing as eating together." He finished the knot. "My Bessie used to say a man can be in a room and 1,000 miles off at the same time. Reckon you'd know something about that." I didn't answer him. I went in and found Adelaide at the stove, back to me, and I stood in the doorway a long moment trying to think what I might say that wasn't about the weather or the herd, and came up with nothing, and went to sit on the porch same as always. I heard the door close soft behind me a while later. She'd come out too, and she sat in the other chair, not close, and we watched the light go down together without a word between us, and somehow that felt like more than any of the suppers had. The first real crack in that silence came from Delilah. Delilah was a gray mare, 20-some years old, half blind in one eye, too old for work and too ornery for anybody's patience but mine, and even mine was thinning. She'd been Ruth's horse, a wedding gift from Ruth's father, gentle as a lamb in her younger years by every account. I kept her out of some obligation I never examined too close, fed her, didn't ride her, didn't much look at her either. She bit stable hands. She'd taken a chunk out of my own forearm the winter before, defending nothing in particular, just being contrary the way old, grieving animals get when nobody explains to them why things changed. Tobias wanted her put down, said so plain more than once. "She's mean and she's useless, and she costs feed same as a horse that earns her keep." "She was Ruth's," I said, which was the whole of my argument, and which I knew wasn't really an argument at all, just a man refusing to finish a piece of grief he hadn't finished yet. Adelaide started going out to the barn in the evenings a few weeks in. I didn't ask why. A man learns not to ask his wife everything, especially a wife he doesn't yet know how to talk to. Turned out she was standing at Delilah's stall each night, not touching her, not fussing, just standing, talking low. I caught it once by accident, coming in from the east fence line after dark, Adelaide's voice, steady as a hymn, telling that miserable old mare about Ohio winters and a brother named Samuel who'd gone to sea 8 years back and never written since. Just talking. The mare's ears were forward, actually forward, which I hadn't seen in 2 years. I stood in the barn doorway and didn't say anything. Felt like I'd walked in on something private, though there was nothing improper in it. Just a woman being patient with a bitter old animal in a way I hadn't managed to be patient with anything since Ruth died. "She bites," I said finally, because I didn't know what else to say. Adelaide didn't turn around. "She hasn't bit me. Give her time. She's not angry at me, Mr. Odell. A pause, her hand still not touching the mare, just resting on the stall rail an inch from her nose. She's angry at being forgotten. I didn't have an answer for that. I went back to the house and sat at the table a long while before Adelaide came in to start supper, and I noticed, really noticed, for maybe the first time since March, that she moved through that kitchen like she'd built it herself. Efficient. Sure. Alone. That night I asked her, over supper, why she'd left Ohio. It wasn't a question I'd planned. It came out of the quiet, the way things do sometimes when a man's been chewing on something all day without meaning to. She set her fork down careful, like she was deciding how much of the true answer to give me. My father had 5 daughters and a dry goods store and not much patience for either. I was the third. Middling in birth order, middling in looks, he liked to say, though he meant it kinder than it sounds written down. My older sisters married well. My younger sisters were young enough to still be hopeful. I was neither. That's not an answer to why you left. It's the beginning of one. She looked at me steady. I clerked in the store from the time I was 12. Kept the books better than my father did, if I'm honest, though he never once said so where anybody could hear. I was useful there the way a good ledger is useful. Nobody asked the ledger its opinion on anything. She almost smiled, though there wasn't much humor in it. Your letter was the first thing in a long while that asked me a direct question and seemed to want a direct answer. I asked if you wanted an arrangement or a marriage. You asked what I wanted, Mr. Odell. My father asked me that maybe twice in 26 years. She picked her fork back up, done with the subject, plainly, and I let it lie, though it sat with me the rest of that night and a good many nights after. Spring came on hard that year, which out here means work, not flowers. Calving season eats a rancher whole. I was up at all hours, out in mud to my knees, and Adelaide, without my asking, without me even thinking to ask, started bringing coffee out to the barn at 3 in the morning. Not because a wife's supposed to. Because she noticed I wasn't sleeping and decided coffee was more useful than a lecture. You don't have to do this, I told her the third night, my hands too cold to properly hold the cup she'd handed me. I know, she was already turning back toward the house. I wanted to see the new calves anyway. That stopped me. You want to see the calves? I've never seen one born. She said it like a woman confessing something bigger than it was. I grew up in a town, Mr. Odell, streets and a schoolhouse and a father who sold dry goods. I've read about ranch life. There's a book I brought, a farmer's almanac and a veterinary manual, both, second hand, from a shop in Millbrook. I hadn't lived any of it until 3 months ago. Why answer the letter then? A woman who reads veterinary manuals could have married a doctor in Ohio easier than a rancher in the territory. She was quiet a moment, watching a heifer struggle in the far pen, patient the way she was patient with everything. Because in my father's house I was furniture, Mr. Odell, useful, rarely spoken to unless spoken through, and never once asked what I thought the store ought to stock for spring, though I was the one kept the books and knew better than anybody what sold. I thought a wife, at least, gets asked her opinion on supper. I thought that would be enough of a start. I thought of every silent meal since March, every question I hadn't asked her, my own house doing to her exactly what she'd left. What do you think we should do about that heifer? I said. Not smooth, not practiced, but I meant it, and something in her face, small, surprised, told me she heard that I meant it. Turn her, I'd guess, Adelaide said. The calf's turned wrong. That's what my reading says anyway, breech they call it. She was right. It took me and Adelaide both, hands in the mud past our elbows, working together in a rhythm neither of us had practiced but somehow found anyway, to turn that calf. And when it finally came out squalling and alive, she laughed, a real laugh, sudden, like it surprised her too. And I realized I hadn't heard that sound in my house since Ruth. I didn't say anything about it, but I thought about it a long time, lying awake that night, my wife asleep down the hall, a woman I'd married for practical reasons and hadn't yet let myself see. By May, Adelaide had a rhythm to her days that I'd started, without quite meaning to, arranging my own days around. Mornings she was in the garden she'd put in against the south wall of the house, turnips, beans, a stubborn patch of corn that Pete swore wouldn't take this far north and that, out of spite or skill, took anyway. Afternoons, the house, the mending, sometimes riding out with me if the work was light enough to spare her, though I noticed she never asked to come, only came when I mentioned it might be useful to have another set of hands, and I started mentioning it more than the work strictly required. Evenings still, the barn. Delilah had taken to nickering when Adelaide came through the door, a sound I hadn't heard that mare make in 2 years, not even for me. By June, Adelaide was riding her, short distances first, out to the near pasture and back, the two of them moving at an old mare's careful walk, and I'd stand at the porch rail and watch and feel something in my chest that I didn't have a good name for yet. Me came out for a visit in June, riding the 2 days from Bozeman with her husband Ezra and their boy, and she took one look at the garden and the mended curtains and Delilah, who let Adelaide's boy pet her nose without so much as a pinned ear, and pulled me aside before she'd even taken her coat off. "Well," me said, "you did better than I expected. It's an arrangement, me. It's a woman who's turned your dead wife's biting horse into a family pet in 3 months, Caleb. That's not an arrangement. That's a woman working a miracle in a house that didn't ask for one." She looked at me hard, the way she had since we were children and she'd caught me in some lie or another. "Does she know that yet, that you see it?" I didn't answer because I didn't know the honest answer, and me, being me, read the silence for exactly what it was and didn't let it go easy. "You wrote her a letter saying you had nothing left to give but fair treatment, Caleb Odell, and I let that letter go because I thought fair treatment was better than the nothing you'd been giving yourself. But I've watched you 5 minutes and I've watched that woman 5 minutes, and I'll tell you plain, you've got more than fair treatment in you. You're just too much of a coward to say it out loud." "That's harsh." "It's true, which is worse." She softened some, the way she did when she'd made her point and didn't need to keep pushing. "Ruth's been gone 2 years, Caleb. You're allowed to want something again. Wanting it doesn't dishonor her." I didn't answer that either, but I turned it over most of that night, and a good many nights after, same as I'd turned over Adelaide's line about Ledger's not being asked their opinion. The thing about a slow thaw is you don't notice the ice is gone until you're standing in water. I couldn't point to the day I stopped thinking of Adelaide as an arrangement and started thinking of her as my wife, in the way that word is supposed to mean something. It came on gradual, in 100 small places. It came in the way she'd started leaving a second cup of coffee out without my asking, time to, when I generally came in from the morning ride. It came in the way I'd started telling her things about the ranch I didn't strictly need to tell her, not reports, but thoughts, the kind of thing a man says out loud to work out what he thinks, and I found I wanted her opinion on them, same as she'd said she wanted mine on supper. It came, most of all in the barn, on an evening in late July, when I found her sitting on an overturned bucket next to Delilah's stall, not talking this time, just sitting, and there was something in the set of her shoulders that told me the day had cost her something. "What's wrong?" I said, and it came out rougher than I meant, worry making my voice do things I hadn't planned. She looked up surprised. I don't think she'd expected me to notice, let alone ask. "Nothing's wrong. I had a letter from home." "Bad news?" "No news, really. That's the trouble with it." She turned a folded paper over in her hands, not opening it again like she'd already read it enough times to have it memorized. "My father wrote to say the store's doing well, 2 paragraphs about inventory, a line at the end asking after my health as an afterthought, the way you'd ask after whether you didn't much care about." A short, humorless laugh. "I don't know why it stings." I knew what I was leaving. I sat down on the hay bale across from her, not close but closer than I generally sat. My pa wasn't much different, I said, which wasn't a thing I talked about ever, and I felt the words cost me something coming out same as hers had cost her. Died when I was 19. Last thing he ever said to me was to check the north fence before winter. Not anything else, just the fence. Did you check it? Every year since. I hadn't thought about that in a long time, the strange loyalty of it, checking a fence a dead man told you to check. Long after checking it stopped being about the fence at all. I think I understand your ledger, Adelaide. Better than I let on, maybe. She looked at me a long moment in the dim gold light of the barn, Delilah's breathing slow and even behind her, and something passed between us that wasn't quite a word yet but was more than silence. I think, she said carefully, I'm starting to be glad I came, Mr. Odell. Not just that it will do. Glad. Caleb, I said, you've called me Mr. Odell 4 months running. I'd take it as a kindness if you'd stop. Caleb then. She tried the name out like she was testing whether it fit her mouth. I think I'm glad I came, Caleb. I didn't say the thing I was thinking, which was that I was glad too, gladder than I had words for yet, because I still had enough of the old caution in me to be afraid of what saying it might cost. But I walked her back to the house that night with my hand near the small of her back, not quite touching, and neither of us moved away from that near touching, and I think we both understood something had shifted, even if neither of us named it yet. August brought trouble, the way August will. A stretch of dry weather turned the creek to a trickle, and word came from the Hargrove spread, Pete's cousin's place, a half-day's ride east, that rustlers had hit 3 ranches along the Yellowstone in as many weeks, moving fast, moving mean, taking what they could and leaving trouble behind them. I doubled the night watch. Tobias and Pete split it between them, and I took my own turns besides, which meant less sleep and a shorter temper, and one evening I came in short with Adelaide over nothing much. A lamp left burning in a room nobody was using, a waste I'd never have remarked on in an easier week. It's an oil lamp, Caleb, not a fortune, she said, more sharp than I'd heard her since March. Oil costs money same as anything. And I've saved this house more in mended clothes than that lamp's burned in a year, if we're keeping ledgers. Her chin came up, that way it did, the way I'd first noticed at the stage stop. I won't be spoken to like a hired girl who's cost you a nickel. I opened my mouth to say something I'd likely have regretted, tired and short-fused as I was, and then I caught myself, because I heard, underneath her sharpness, the same thing she'd told me back in May. A lifetime of being spoken to like she wasn't worth a direct word, and here I was, worn thin by rustler trouble, doing exactly that to her. You're right, I said instead, which cost me some pride but less than the alternative would have. I'm short with you and it isn't fair. It's the rustler talk, not the lamp. She studied me, some of the sharpness going out of her shoulders. You could have just said that first. I could have. I'm not always quick to say the right thing first. Ruth used to tell me that too. It was the first time I'd said Ruth's name to her, without the name feeling like a wall between us. Adelaide went still a moment, like she was deciding whether to step into that opening or let it close. Tell me about her, she said finally. Not tonight necessarily, but sometime. I'd like to know the woman whose horse trusts me and whose husband checks a fence every year because his father once mentioned it. I hadn't expected the ask, and I hadn't expected how much I wanted to answer it. She was quick, I said slow, feeling my way into words I hadn't used in 2 years. Quicker than me with people with talk. She'd have liked you, I think. She wasn't a woman for silence the way I am. She'd have had you laughing inside a week, not 4 months. I'm not laughing yet. You laughed turning that calf in May. I've been listening for it since. That got the sharpness gone entirely, replaced with something softer, something that looked in the lamplight almost like the way Ruth used to look at me, though I caught myself before I finished that thought, because Adelaide wasn't Ruth and didn't deserve to be measured against a ghost, not even a kindly one. She deserved to be seen for herself. I was starting, slow as August dust settling, to see her. The rustlers never hit Cedar Draw, moved on north. We heard later, caught eventually near the Canadian line, but the watch and the worry left me stretched thin into September. And it was Adelaide in the end, who caught the thing I'd missed. A fever working through 3 of the young stock, quiet at first, the kind of quiet sickness that kills a herd slow if nobody's paying close enough attention. "That heifer's off her feed," she said to me one morning, nodding at a 2-year-old standing apart from the others, head low. "She's shy of the herd is all, some are." She's been shy of the herd 3 days running, and yesterday it was 2, and the day before that it was 1. Adelaide's voice had the particular patience of a woman laying out a ledger she'd already balanced twice. "I've been watching, I think it's spreading." I hadn't been watching, not close, not with the rustler trouble eating my attention all month, and it shamed me some to have my own wife catch what I'd missed on my own land. But I checked the heifer, and 2 others besides that showed the same slow listlessness, and I sent Tobias for the horse doctor out of Miles City that same afternoon, and between the doctor's medicine and Adelaide's insistence on separating the sick stock quick. "Done," she said, on the strength of what her veterinary manual called quarantine, a word I'd never had cause to use before that week. We lost 4 head instead of what could easily have been 40. The horse doctor, a dry, sharp-tongued man named Whitfield, said as much plain, packing up his kit. "Your wife's got better instincts than half the ranchers I doctor for Odell. You do well to listen to her closer." "I'm learning to," I said, and meant it, and caught Adelaide's small, pleased look out of the corner of my eye, and felt something in my chest ease that had been tight since March. That night over a supper that had gone back to being a real conversation, back and forth, her asking about Whitfield's other calls, me asking what else her manual said about herd sickness, I found myself watching her hands as she talked, steady hands, capable, the same hands that had gentled a bitter old mare and turned a breech calf and caught a sickness I'd missed, and I thought, plain and sudden as weather changing, I could love this woman. Not arrangement, not fair treatment. Love, the real word, the one I hadn't let myself think since Ruth. I didn't say it, not yet, but I thought it, and once thought it didn't leave me. Autumn moved fast into a hard winter that year. The old-timers said it plain, said they hadn't seen a November like it in a decade, and by the first week of December, we were digging cattle out of drifts that came up past a man's waist. I was out from before dawn to well after dark most days, and Adelaide ran the house, and more than once that month, rode out herself to help haze stock toward the low pasture where the wind couldn't pile the snow so deep. She was good on a horse by then. Delilah's patient teaching and a summer's practice had made her better than good, in fact, steady enough that Pete stopped calling her the Mrs. behind her back and started calling her Ms. Odell, and she can ride the way he'd say it about anybody he respected. The blizzard that near broke us came the 3rd week of November, a wall of white that rolled down off the mountains with no more warning than an hour's worth of wrong-colored sky. I was out on the North Range when it hit, further from the house than I should have let myself get that time of year, and by the time I understood how bad it was going to be, the light had gone strange and thin, and the wind had teeth in it. I won't dress up what happened next. I got turned around. A man who's ridden a range 15 years telling you he got turned around sounds like a foolish thing to admit, but a blizzard doesn't care how many years you've ridden, and mine came down so total I couldn't see my horse's ears past his mane. I found a coulee, got the horse into what shelter it offered, and settled in to wait it out, colder than I'd been since I was a boy, and somewhere in that white roaring nothing I thought, not with fear exactly, more with a kind of tired clarity, that I hadn't told Adelaide the thing I'd been carrying since the night of the sick heifer. That thought scared me more than the cold did. I don't know how long I was out there. Long enough that when Tobias found me, Tobias and Adelaide both, she'd insisted on riding out with the search the moment the worst of the wind broke, over Pete's objection and my own absent one. I was slow to speak, slower to move, my hands too stiff to properly hold the reins. Adelaide got down off her horse before it had fully stopped and had her arms around me before I'd got a word out, which wasn't like her. She wasn't a woman for open displays, not in 4 seasons of marriage, not even in the barn with Delilah where nobody but the horse could see her soft moments. And I understood, in that rough embrace out in the freezing wreck of the storm's tail end, that I'd scared her badly. And that being scared for me meant something she hadn't let herself say plain any more than I had. "You fool man," she said into my collar, and her voice broke on it, which I'd never heard it do, not once, not even talking about her father's 2-paragraph letters. "You absolute fool. 15 years on this range and you get turned around by weather." "I'm sorry," I said, which felt inadequate to the size of the thing and true anyway. We got back to the house past midnight. The fire built up high, my hands and feet aching back to feeling in a way that hurt worse than the cold had, and Adelaide sat with me at the hearth long after Tobias and Pete had gone to their own beds, wrapping my hands in warmed cloths, not talking much, just present, steady, showing up the way she'd told me back in the summer that trust was built. "I have something to tell you," I said finally, when the shaking had mostly stopped and the fear in her face had eased into something quieter. "Been carrying it a while, didn't know how to say it or when." "Say it now, then. I'd rather have it plain than wait." I looked at her, really looked in the firelight, at the woman who'd stepped off a stage in March, weighing what a stranger's ranch would cost her, and who'd spent 9 months since gentling a bitter old horse, and catching a sickness I'd missed, and riding out into a dying blizzard because she couldn't sit safe at home not knowing if I was alive. And I said the plainest true thing I had in me. "I love you, Adelaide, not as an arrangement, not as fair treatment. I love you the way I didn't think I had left in me to love anybody again. And I've known it since the night of the sick heifer and been too much of a coward, same as my sister said, to say it out loud." She didn't answer right away. Adelaide wasn't a woman for quick words, not on the things that mattered. I'd learned that about her, same as I'd learned. She took her coffee black and hummed old hymns kneading bread, and stood a long while at Delilah's stall before she ever touched the mare, patient, letting trust build at its own pace rather than forcing it. So I waited, my hands still wrapped in her warmed cloths, and let her take the time she needed. "I told you once," she said finally, "that I came here not knowing what I'd find." That fair was enough to start on. Her eyes were bright in the firelight, though she wasn't even now a woman for tears. "I didn't know in March that I'd find a man who checks a fence his dead father mentioned once, or gentles a horse out of some loyalty he won't examine too close, or nearly freezes to death on his own range because the work never lets him rest. I didn't know I'd come to love him for exactly those things. But I have Caleb. I chose to come here not knowing. I choose now to stay knowing." I don't know that I've got the words to properly set down what passed between us after that. Some things a man keeps for himself, even telling a story meant for others to hear. But I'll say this. It wasn't the wedding in March that made Adelaide my wife. Not really. Not in the way that word is supposed to carry weight. It was that night by the fire, cold finally driven out of my hands, both of us saying plain what we'd been too cautious to say for the better part of a year. Delilah lived 3 more winters after that one, ornery to the end, gentle only with the 2 of us, and in her final year, with our eldest daughter, who took to the old mare the same patient way her mother had. We buried her under the cottonwood by the creek, same spot Adelaide used to stand talking to her those first lonesome months, back before either of us had let the other one all the way in. We had 4 children in that house before I was through, 2 boys, 2 girls, all of them raised on ranch work and on the particular quiet steadiness Adelaide brought to everything she touched. Every one of them grew up hearing the story of the gray mare who welcomed their mother before I ever did, and I never once minded being the slower half of that story. A man's allowed to be slow, I've come to think, so long as he gets there in the end, and shows up faithfully once he has. Adelaide kept a ledger her whole life, the ranch accounts, neat as anything her father's store had ever produced, And more than once over the years I caught her adding a line to it that wasn't about cattle or feed at all, a date, a small note, private things she never explained and I never asked after, though I have my guesses. I think she was still, in her own quiet way, keeping account of what a day was worth. I think by the end the ledger came out generous. Marriage begun as a practical arrangement isn't much of a foundation, folks will tell you. Maybe not on paper. But I've found a house gets built plank by plank, same as trust does, one shown up for day at a time. One hard winter survived. One bitter old mare gentled slow. And by the time I understood what I had in Adelaide Voss, I understood it the way a man understands ground he stood on his whole life and only just learned, to his lasting gratitude, was solid clear through.